Erie, Pennsylvania is a city on the south shore of Lake Erie, halfway between New York and Ohio. In August, the weather is warm but often cloudy, perfect for swimming in the surrounding Great Lakes. It was August the 28th, 2003, when a man named Brian Wells arrived at a local pizzeria where he worked as a pizza delivery driver. For 10 years, he had been one of their most loyal employees, only ever missing one day of work following the death of his beloved cat. But this day, an order placed from a payphone to number 8631 Peach Street, only a few kilometres from the pizzeria, would change the course of multiple lives. Once he arrived at the address, a collar bomb would be placed around his neck, fitted with a timer. He would also be handed a 7-page letter outlining a bizarre scavenger hunt he was ordered to complete. The words, "Act now, think later or you will die," were scrawled at the bottom of the instructions. But was a collar bomb even real? How did it end up around Brian Wells's neck? And what was this really all about? What took place over the next few hours has been described by CNN as the only crime of its kind, and one of the most complicated and bizarre crimes in the annals of the FBI. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast looking into the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with investigative reporter Rich Shapiro. Rich is the author of a long-form piece on the collar bomb heist for Wired and researched the case extensively in the process. He is also a reporter for NBC News in the United States. It's almost 2:30 on August the 28th, 2003, and a middle-aged man hands a bank teller a note. What does that note ask that woman to do?
The note essentially says for her to get her employees and to get the codes to a vault that's in the back of the bank and to pull out $250,000 and to fill a bag up with that amount of money. And it makes clear that she has only 15 minutes to complete this task.
And the man who actually passes her that note, he reveals a device that's dangling from his neck, doesn't he?
Correct. He kind of nods towards his neck, and it's very clear to the eye to see that there's something kind of bulging from underneath his collar. It's this kind of box-like device made out of metal that is very unusual to see.
And when you say it's unusual to see, is it something that actually goes around his neck? Like, can you describe what that collar device actually looked like?
It did actually go around his neck. It was essentially a heavy piece of metal that, if you can picture like a large clamp, it essentially was a collar, a metal collar that was dangling from off of his neck. It looked very much like a large, oversized handcuff.
And the man's name was Brian Wells. What do we know about who he was? What did he do for a living, and what kind of man was he?
Brian Wells was a middle-aged pizza delivery man. He was 46 years old. He drove a modest car, a Geo Metro. He was a quiet man. He was someone who didn't have a lot of friends, who largely kept to himself, and was someone who had some learning disabilities as well. But he had been a very loyal employee of a pizzeria and had worked as a delivery man for quite some time.
And what did that bank teller decide to do when he handed her that note? Because that's an enormous amount of money, and I can imagine that it would have been a feat to sort of fulfill the task that he'd given her.
Yes. She essentially said to him that she couldn't get into the vault, but she filled up his bag with a significant amount of money. It was about a little bit over $8,500 in U.S. cash. And she handed him the bag, and he walked out of the bank.
And when he walked out of the bank, did she called the police pretty quickly? Had anyone else witnessed this incident?
Yes, there were other customers in the bank. There were also employees of the bank. And yes, in fact, the police were called, as I recalled, basically before he was even out of the bank, the police had been called.
And he appears to have obviously this collar bomb around his neck, and then the police are called, and then they find him pretty soon afterwards, don't they?
Correct. He was not even a mile away when the police identified his car, stopped him, and ordered him out of the vehicle.
I got a phone call approximately about 3:40 saying that there was a man laying in the middle of Peach Street. And then I got another phone call directly after that saying that there might have been a bomb-related incident. So I dispatched Janet, our photographer, one of our shooters, up to the scene. She got there to find Brian on the ground with the Erie bomb squad trying to find out what was going on.
And how does he explain to them how this device turned up around his neck?
He told the police at that time that he had gone out to deliver pizza, and while he was on this run, a group of men, and he described them as a group of black men, had confronted him and basically chained this bomb around his neck at gunpoint, and that it was they who forced him to rob the bank.
And he's then made to sort of kneel on a footpath for 20 minutes or so. Did the police attempt to remove that collar bomb? What sort of strategy did they have at that point?
The police were extremely confused over the situation, as frankly anyone would be had they been in this situation. Once they pulled him out of the vehicle and he told them that he had a bomb around his neck and that it was going to go off, I think it was only when they actually took a closer look under his shirt and could see this thing bulging that they realized this is a situation unlike any that they had ever seen before. And they called in the bomb squad, but the bomb squad was not located right there. So there was a period of time that passed with the officers essentially just standing around Brian Wells, who was handcuffed and seated on the pavement, essentially on the street. As these officers were waiting for the bomb squad to arrive, they did not try to take the bomb off themselves, at the risk that it could go off. And I think at that point, they didn't know what to believe.
When you say the police are standing around, how close are they to him? Because you would imagine that there'd be some fear that if it were to go off, then, they could be within range.
Yeah, I think there was certainly that kind of fear. I don't recall offhand how close they were. I think it was probably at least 30 feet or so, 20 meters at least, I believe it was.
And they then recall hearing an unusual beeping coming from the collar. What happened next?
So the collar started to beep. The sounds of the beep accelerated. Beep, 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 beep. And then came a boom. The device exploded and its force basically threw Brian Wells onto his back. There was a puff of smoke. The police officers who were nearby kind of cowered behind their vehicles, or in some cases just kind of knelt to the ground. After the smoke cleared and they got a chance to get closer to Brian Wells, it became clear that the explosion took his life.
What sort of injuries did he sustain? What sort of does something like that exploding around your neck, what does it actually do to a person?
In his case, he essentially had a gash in his chest. I think it was about 6 inches or so. And there was also head trauma, I believe. I mean, the device certainly had some power to it and was designed to emit kind of great force.
The man was sitting there as he was since about 3 o'clock when all of a sudden a loud explosion and he flipped onto his back and the state police troopers scrambled. They're still holding guns on him, as you can see. They're still not exactly sure his condition. It is apparent that he did have a bomb and he detonated it in front of the state troopers and the FBI agents that have been here since this standoff started about a half an hour ago.
And the police then began a pretty extensive search and found a note inside his car which had a number of instructions. What sort of things did it say he had to do?
So what the notes essentially laid out was this bizarre scavenger hunt that entailed him following a series of clues that would take him around the city of Erie. And if he went to the right places, he would find keys that would essentially go into the collar bomb and allow him to disable it. So he basically had to go around from place to place to collect a series of keys, and only if he obtained these keys in a certain amount of time would he be able to, in fact, disengage the bomb.
And then the police sort of went on this scavenger hunt, didn't they, to sort of see where it might take them?
That's correct. They essentially started following the clues, and they went to the first location, which was a McDonald's, and they found the next clue. And from there, they went to another location where there was another clue that was supposed to be there. And at the next location, they found a note that directed them to a place. But when they got there, there was a jar that was empty. So it appeared to them that there was somebody who had been monitoring this entire situation, and at some point before the police got there, this person or these people had in fact removed the next clue, which was obviously quite perplexing and unsettling to the investigators.
Did the police get the sense that the scavenger hunt could have been completed, or was it almost like the person had been set up to fail?
They ultimately concluded that the person was set up to fail, that there was no way to complete the scavenger hunt in the amount of time that Brian was told he had to complete it. And further, they determined that there was no way to actually disable the bomb.
And what do we know about how the scavenger hunt actually began for Brian? Because there was a call to the pizzeria that he was working at. What happened after that, and what do we know about what that call actually said?
So shortly before he showed up at the bank, he was at the pizzeria. It was called Mamma Mia's Pizzeria. It seemed like any other day. There was a call in to the pizza shop at about 1:30 p.m. that afternoon. It was for 2 pies, sausage and pepperoni. And the location was this place. It was just on the outskirts of the city. And it was essentially a dirt road that led to this TV transmission tower. It was in a wooded area off a pretty busy main road in Erie. And the investigators obviously tried to retrace Mr. Wells' footsteps. So they went there, and there just wasn't that much there, frankly. It was kind of this grassy, wooded area. They did find shoe prints that seemed to match Wells's footwear. There were tire tracks that matched the threads on his car. But other than that, at that point, they didn't really turn up any evidence that or any clues to give them a greater understanding of what might have happened.
Here, the FBI had 2 composite drawings of individuals they were looking for, seen running from near the mall. The truth is, this came to no fruition for them. I mean, there was never anybody came forward and said, "I know who those people are." The investigation continued, but also I think as things dried up for them, they were stopping cars and asking if they had seen anything.
Did they turn anything up?
No, and as far as we know, nothing came out of the trolling.
The day afterwards, though, a reporter was called to that satellite dish and saw a tall, heavy-set man named Bill Rothstein. What can you tell us about him?
So Bill Rothstein was an interesting character, well known to the area, a large, heavy-set man who always seemed to wear overalls. He had a beard. He spoke in this very dignified way. He was an educated man. He took pride in his language. He was essentially a handyman, very bright, very good with mechanics, he was not married, and he had lived there for quite some time.
And a month later, he made a phone call to police about something that he'd found in his freezer. What did he report?
He called 911 to report a dead body in his freezer.
And who was that man in the freezer?
The body was a guy named James Roden, who was someone who was the boyfriend of one of Bill Rothstein's friends. It was actually an ex-girlfriend of his named Marjorie Deal Armstrong.
Which you initiated calls to the state police. Could you explain what that was all about?
Okay, that was basic. There was a person I had known since the late 60s, early 70s. She had a body in her house that she wanted removed. I helped her with it. I put it basically in my garage. That Saturday, she wanted it completely destroyed.
Okay, the woman being
Marjorie Armstrong, or Marjorie Deal Armstrong. Marjorie Deal's her maiden name. Marjorie Armstrong was her married name.
okay, and that's why you called the state police.
I would call the state police because I did not want anything to do with that, and I was also fearful of what would happen should she find that out, or should I refuse to do that.
After that, there was a note left. What did that note say that was on the premises?
Yeah, so when police were at Rothstein's house, basically responding to the call of a body in the freezer, they found in one of his drawers a note that in fact read like a suicide note. It said things, like he apologized to people to his loved ones, and it also said, there's a body in the freezer, and that body belongs to Jim Roden. Rothstein wrote that he did not kill him or have anything to do with the death. And, the first line of this note kind of had this curious statement. It said, "This has nothing to do with the Wells case."
It's almost comical that he would include that detail. Was he a suspect at that point?
No, he was not.
And so in April 2005, to go a little bit further along, police received a phone call regarding a confession of sorts made by Marjorie, who you referred to before. Before we go into that, what can you tell us about her and her history?
Sure. Marjorie Deal Armstrong was a very well-known person in Erie, and she was well-known because she had a history of her loved ones turning up dead. In 1984, she was charged with murdering her boyfriend. She actually claimed self-defense and got off. Not long after that, her new husband, he died as well, apparently of a cerebral brain hemorrhage, but there were questions over whether or not he had also sustained a head injury. She was a brilliant person. She had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of literature, of history. She was someone who in high school was considered one of the brightest and one of the most promising students. But at a certain point, she also started developing signs of mental illness, and that worsened in time. And it became clear that she suffered from bipolar disorder and perhaps some other things. That also just became kind of a significant part of her personality, and she never quite reached the potential that she seemed to exhibit earlier in her life.
And Bill and her had dated at one point, but were now sort of friends. And they both had problems with hoarding, didn't they?
Yeah, mainly her. At a certain point, when cops were investigating her, they found something like hundreds of pounds of butter inside her house, more than 700 pounds of cheese, rotting cheese inside of her house. It was covered in trash. It was an unpleasant sight for sure.
What had eventually been told to those police about the collar bomb incident? Because she'd gone in and spoken to a police officer, and then it sort of all came together in terms of how it related.
She basically told them that she knew details of what happened, and she intimated that to them that she had some information that would be helpful to them. She also told them that she was close by when it happened, and that Brian Wells was not just a victim, but he had actually been in on the plot. And she said that Bill Rothstein was as well, and it was actually Rothstein who was the mastermind of the whole thing.
And what did she say her involvement was specifically?
She was somewhat vague about her involvement. She basically told them that it was Rothstein who was the main player in all of this, and that she was a bit player and didn't really understand everything that was happening or wasn't even aware of everything that was happening.
You said before that she suggested that Brian Wells was not just a hostage but more of a willing participant. Why would he have agreed to that? Did she suggest why he would have been part of that?
She did not make it clear at the time, I don't believe, but the police would find out later that Brian Wells was apparently a kind of a willing participant in a bank robbery plot, but was ultimately double-crossed and was forced into this role where he had no chance of escaping and was going to be killed.
And what did they think his motivation or incentive was? Was it money because he was robbing a bank? Was there sort of some agreement that they would share whatever money they could make out of it?
The question as to what everyone originally thought they were going to get out of it and what they thought was going to happen was never really resolved satisfactorily. But that's the presumption. The presumption is that there were these people involved. They all saw this as a bank robbery, and they all saw themselves as playing a role in that, and that role would lead to them getting a portion of the spoils.
And then a new witness came forward by the name of Kenneth Barnes. Who was he?
Kenneth Barnes was a TV repairman who lived in Erie. He was also someone who sold drugs out of his house and was known to the police and was not considered an especially upstanding member of the community.
Why was that? Did he have a criminal record?
Just because he was known to be involved in drugs and he was known to associate with prostitutes and the like.
And he sort of suggested that Marjorie was more involved in the robbery than she had initially told police. Did he have any idea of what her motivation had been?
What he told the police is that Marjorie told him that she wanted to rob the bank to get enough money to pay someone, namely him, to kill her father, who she believed was blowing through her inheritance, if you can follow that.
And so it seems like a very elaborate plot for someone who wanted money. Do you think that there was another element of wanting to be clever and wanting to have something that was going to capture headlines all over the world or something? Because it's almost like a movie plot.
Yeah, I would say that if your sole purpose was to get money, there are more subtle ways to do it than to hire a pizza delivery man, put a bomb around his neck, send him into a bank, and have him go on this bizarre scavenger hunt afterwards. So it certainly seems as if obtaining money was not the only purpose of this, and that there was a certain desire to get attention, to make headlines.
And at this point, there are a number of people implicated and who appear to have known about the plot. How does this relate to the body in the freezer? So the body is found in the freezer a month or so later and is obviously the police are called. What do they find about how it ended up there and what happened to that man?
So the investigators ultimately determined that Marjorie Dale Armstrong killed that man, whose name is James Roden, and she killed him because basically he threatened to go to the police and tell them about the Brian Wells case and Marjorie's role in it. So she, not wanting that to happen, apparently shot and killed her one-time boyfriend, James Roden.
Who was eventually charged with the actual robbery? Because there are obviously multiple people, and I imagine there are different levels of involvement, whether you were a conspirator or whether you were someone who kind of thought up the plot. Who was actually charged?
There were two people charged. One was Marjorie Dale Armstrong, and the other one was Kenneth Barnes.
The only reason that Bill avoided conviction was because he died a few years earlier, didn't he?
That's correct. He died of leukemia, and even when he was on his deathbed, investigators came to talk to him, and he denied having any role in the Brian Wells case.
And how long were the sentences of the people who were convicted, Marjorie and Kenneth?
Ken Barnes pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, I believe, and Marjorie Dale Armstrong was convicted at trial and sentenced to life in prison.
Do you think with Bill obviously dying before a lot of the police got sort of the answers that they wanted, do you think that there are questions about this case that we won't ever have the answers to?
Yes, I do. I think the fact that Bill Rothstein died before telling anyone what he knew or why he might have done what he did means that there will always be questions about this case that will go unanswered. It will likely be impossible to ever glean exactly what happened and why.
And finally, the biggest question about this case that still remains is about Brian Wells's involvement. Do you think that he was a conspirator, or do you think that it's possible that he was actually just a hostage?
The short answer is I'm not sure what to believe. The police certainly were convinced that he was a conspirator, at least to start, and that he was ultimately double-crossed and ended up becoming the victim against his will. And they came to that conclusion based on conversations with some of the co-conspirators, including Ken Barnes. And they also spoke to witnesses who apparently saw Brian Wells with the others in the days leading up to the incident, as if they were preparing for what was to come and making preparations.
And I guess the idea is that he might have thought that the collar bomb itself wasn't real because it was strangely designed and there were things that did work and things that didn't. So when people say that he was dragged into it and then it was, he later realised how serious the situation was, do you think it's possible that he didn't realise that this was going to be a real bomb with real consequences?
Well, that's a possibility, or it could be that he never knew anything about a collar bomb, that was never made clear to him at all, that was going to be part of this crime, at least according to one of the people involved, Kenneth Barnes. Once he saw this device and that it was going to be put around his neck, he actually tried to run away, but the others corralled him and kind of forced him at gunpoint to put it on. So that was how one person explained what happened, and it seems that that's what the authorities came to believe as well.
Yeah, it's an enormous question because you do wonder, how you end up in a situation like that. And I suppose those final hours of him and his mindset are, some of the most interesting of this story, to work out how terrified he must have been and if he was double-crossed or if he was someone who was just a victim. So thank you so much for speaking to us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Ever find a group of people like-minded enough to want to do a plot like this. It just had never happened. And they called themselves the fractured intellectuals, meaning they were really, really bright, but they couldn't get along with anybody other than their own social group.
He's a filthy liar.
What do you have to say about Rothstein?
Rothstein should be charged with the murder of Brian Wells and a lot of other charges, and he got a fugitive from justice, a rapist that I turned into the FBI in his house for 2 years.
He says you committed the murder.
Rothstein is a filthy liar.
Ken, did you do it? No?
Did you make the bomb?
Marjorie said you did. Did you make the bomb?
No.
When you were watching across the street, did you know that Brian Wells was going to die?
Greed, power, and a group of diabolical characters put together one of the most maniacal plots in criminal history.
You can find Rich Shapiro's research into the case of the collar bomb heist by following the links in the description of this episode. Rich's reporting for NBC News can also be found via the show notes. Images, videos and maps relating to this episode can be found in our closed Facebook group. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join the group. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper.